Hey, hi everyone. I think most of the learners have joined and we can start today's particular session. I'll be your host for today's session. A little bit about me. I'm Barnendu. I head category management for pre-level by Unacademy. Been associated with the Unacademy group since the last 2 years. That's a little bit about me. Uh, with great pleasure, I would like to welcome Mr. Prasad Katti in today's session, who is our guest for today. A little bit about Prasad. Well, Prasad has more than 2 decades of industry experience where he has worked with top companies like Visa, Adobe, and Cisco Systems to name a few. Right. So I would like to pass the mic to Prasad, where he can tell us a little bit more about his career and give a quick introduction before we move ahead to the questions.
Hi, sure. Thanks, Bernardo, for the quick intro. And hello, everyone, and good evening to all of you. So first, I will start with a quick intro of myself. And I'm Prasad Katti. I'm a software professional for about 2 decades now. So I've had the privilege of witnessing multiple technology transitions over this period, especially on web development. And I'm grateful for the experience because it allows me to put things into perspective. So the web and what it offers today has gone through multiple transitions from Web 1.0 when it was initially envisioned, and then subsequently Web 2.0 when companies like, let's say, Facebook or Twitter made their entry into the landscape. And now we're on the cusp of the Web 3.0 transition, which could be happening anytime soon. So I'd be happy to share some of my experiences on that and much more. And importantly, very happy to be here with you all and share some of my perspectives and hoping that there would be many takeaways and from that, and it triggers some internal dialogue and some thought process within yourself. And I hope it's going to be a good use of your time. So yeah, thank you for that introduction. And I look forward to interacting with you in this particular session. And I know that you are some of the brightest and the best in the software talent that the software talent has to offer. So yeah, get ready to rock.
Thanks a lot, Prasad. We'll quickly move to the questions for our guest lecture session. So,
Sure.
Prasad, just to begin with, if you can give our learners a deep overview of your journey, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about the obstacles that you might have faced in your initial days and how did you overcome them.
Sure. So, a couple of things, right? So, when I started out, things were a lot much more different actually from what the situation is right now. So, to begin with, when I came on board, we had this tug of war that was happening between open systems and the closed systems, right? So, some of the proprietary systems that we had in back then, in terms of Microsoft owning some of the, Visual C++, Visual Basic, those kind of stuff, which was very proprietary in nature, which was kind of license oriented, if you will. But fast forward to 2 decades now, and now everything is, everybody's free to create, everybody's free to build stuff on the internet, right? Thanks to the open systems, where first it was the Sun Microsystems and the Java board, which came on board, and then essentially offered the software without any licensing, and people were able to build interesting solutions from there. And now, fast forward to, let's say, 2 decades now, we have Node.js, we have React.js, and a lot of other cloud providers which are very open in terms of embracing the ideas and allowing people to experiment and make sure that the ideas take shape. And that's the beauty that I find right now, compared to, let's say, 2 decades back when I started, where it is much more proprietary. And I also feel that people today who are entering into the professional world are much more prepared. They have much better pulse on what's happening in the industry compared to what was happening back then. And I guess a part of it is also because of the fact that they're a lot more smarter, relatively speaking, and also the fact that we have a lot of information. This is the age of information, and a lot of information is available to us now, and they it only makes them smart and much better equipped in terms of making the right decisions, making the making the right judgments, in my opinion. So so that is what I find as a primary difference. But apart from that, I also see that when I started out, web was actually evolving. I didn't even start with a as a web developer back then. It was, I think, the first job that I had was to develop a character user interface, which was using DOS as the operating system, or Linux or Unix as the operating system. So a lot of things have changed back comparatively. I mean, if you have to look at a comparative analysis, and subsequently, yeah, I moved to the graphical user interface, and then which was mostly a desktop app kind of a environment. And of course, we had the web make its way after the HTTP protocol itself was declared as the kind of de facto standard for communication on the web. So that was one of the interesting and a kind of groundbreaking or movement or watershed moment in the computing science world. So something that was very iconic or very important, and that, and also the opening up of the internet. And subsequently, we've seen that we've gone through multiple iterations. So we had the dot-com buzz, which happened in the early 2000s, which resulted in a lot of kind of a recession-like movement back then, and a lot of uncertainty for people entering into software world back then. But subsequently, it's been very nice actually, because with so much of innovation that's happening in computing in general, for that matter, and innovation in the computing trends or the architectures or the designs that we've seen over the past 15, 20 years. I think the rate of innovation is just shot through the roof, in my opinion, and it's allowed people to come up with very interesting applications, for the benefit of humankind in general, right? So, for example, if you look at the maps, that has been developed by Google, and subsequently it's done by multiple other people as well. It's given rise to a lot of interesting applications, driven primarily by the API economy, where software is right now available as a service, right, on a trial basis, right, and also on a subscription basis, and on a pay as you go model. So it is really a win-win situation, and that is also helped by the fact that we have a very good internet speed right now, broadband speeds, and which allows information to reach every nook and corner of the world, right? And the fact that now the internet is accessible on devices of all dimensions. So, for example, earlier when we started out, the desktop was the only device on which we could access the internet, and we didn't even have access to the laptops. And subsequently, 10 years down the line, it was much more like, we had access to the laptops, and mobile phones were unheard of, actually. I mean, internet on the mobile phones was unheard of. But subsequently, we had these smartphone era that really kicked into high gear, and we had a lot of interesting innovation and applications that came through, and apparently the mobile app development itself is one of the streams where people specialize in right now. So very interesting times. So from that perspective, a lot of the people from all of your cohorts has plenty to cheer about. They have a lot going on for them, and definitely I see them to express themselves much better with all of this opening up.
Great, Prasad. So that was really helpful, how you know, apart from your career, also you explained how technology has evolved, right? So that was really, very insightful. Can we please move ahead to the next question? Yeah. So Prasad, also, the learners have posted us some of the questions, and a lot of learners want to know more about what your responsibilities were at Visa, and what kind of uh, tech projects you were typically leading during your tenure at Visa.
Sure. So, couple of things, right? So I also wanted to, before I get there, I also wanted to touch upon a few more things. So, for example, how the cloud itself as a platform has enabled a lot of businesses, right? So earlier, to actually to try out a particular experiment or try out a particular idea, it meant that the creators or innovators had to create a big stack of computers or a lab setup, right, and which involved a lot of upfront investment. That was the capital expenditure would be gone into that, and they also needed an operational expenditure budget for them to maintain some of these things, right? And they also need to look at the licensing aspect of the softwares, and also one of them, they were not sure whether the experiments would be fruitful, they would bear the right kind of results and stuff like that. So there was a fear of the collateral damage, right? So, for example, if the experiments failed, midway, a lot of their expensive investments would be of no use. They didn't know how to essentially um, let go of those investments, right? So because they had to either sell it off at a very low price, or they didn't know what to do with that. So what cloud has done, I mean, especially towards the start of 2010, when cloud as a platform to deploy software, to access software, became mainstream, it is cloud computing has taken shape in a massive way. So we have had infrastructure as a service, we have software as a service, we have platform as a service, which have come to the fore, which have come to the party. So high performance computing options have become available to all the innovators across the globe. Right. So, for example, if I have to stand up a very, let's say, expensive machine learning cluster, which have GPU, machines, right? Which have GPUs, machines which have or virtual machines, so to speak, with GPUs that would be very expensive if I had to do it on my own. But with cloud computing, that becomes available, and I can perform my experiments, whether it's going to be on, let's say, bioinformatics, or any kind of genome sequencing, which is something to do with our genetics, right? Or it could be something to do with getting trying out some cures for some of the very dreaded diseases like cancers. It's become easier for people to experiment and find solutions that can do a lot of good in turn to the humankind. So in case the experiments failed, you don't have to worry about them. You just have to dismantle the infrastructure, right? So from that standpoint, a lot of the cloud platforms have become very affordable. They become very affordable, and we have a lot of AWS. I'm sorry, a lot of the cloud providers in form of AWS and Azure and also GCP. So that's definitely kind of fast tracked some of the innovation in our field. So when you go on to your jobs, right? So obviously, some of you are full stack engineers, some of you are backend engineers, some of you are, I think, front end specialize in front end engineering. I think some of the aspects they also have to look at is where do you actually uh, run these softwares, right, and how it impacts them. Are you running in the cloud, or are you going to be running in on, let's say, on-prem hardware or on-prem data centers, right? And some of that will actually influence how you design your solutions, how you design your algorithms, right? So that's going to be key. So something that you need to keep that at the back of your mind. So very very important takeaway there. So I hope and I'm sure some of you, all of you will take that into account when you actually go ahead and build your solutions and propose your solutions when you actually start doing the work at your preferred employers. Right. So the web development has flourished big time in the cloud, and it is going to continue to flourish in the cloud because a lot of the SMBs, for example, the small and medium businesses, they cannot afford to have their own data centers. It's only the big players, right? The Microsofts, or the Googles, or for that matter, the LinkedIn's and stuff like that. They can afford their own data centers, and people who did not afford to, let's say, um, put their data on the cloud for, let's say, conformance reasons, right? Or for that matter, they could be an issue with data locality. So data cannot go out from a particular country outside of, let's say, to another country, another region. Only they can afford to have their own regional data centers. All of them, everyone else will essentially rely on the cloud infrastructure to host their solutions and serve their customers in a way that is very highly performant, and also in a way that's in line with customer expectations. Ultimately, customers are every business is driven by customers, right? So it has to be built um, backwards from the customer expectations. It is not about the technology that you use. It is not about how shiny your technology is. That doesn't matter. End of the day, if it is going to address the customers' needs, I think that's what is going to make you popular. That's what is going to make you successful in the industry. So coming back to the question, or rather the question that was posed by you guys. So my responsibilities at Visa have been multi-pronged. So I've been involved in building solutions essentially that are expected to scale to the global traffic, and to design frameworks and expand the digital payment capabilities to newer geographies, right? Build omni-channel interfaces. So, for example, we might be having customers who could also be partners, right? So who could also be trying to, rebrand or relabel the solutions, right? And then board their own customers in turn, right? So you have to make omni-channel interfaces available to them. And eventually that would lead to a sustainable growth and, allow people to tap into newer markets, right? So my mission was essentially to provide a digitally connected world when it came to electronic payments. So and essentially penetrate different parts of the world where we could take electronic payments to all the people in the world. So that was the mission statement that we had, and that's how most of the products and projects were run.
Okay, Prasad, good to understand that in the level of detail in which you explain. A lot of learners also, Prasad, want to understand that what is the typical journey of a software engineer, right? Like you start as an SD1, right? So if you can tell our learners about the entire journey and also the most important phases in that journey, and what are the best practices probably, or the hacks one can employ in at each stage to grow faster or grow better in their career.
Sure. Yeah, it's a very valid point and a very important aspect of your essentially journey in terms of how you navigate the journey itself as you go through different career transitions and go through the different rungs of the career ladder, right? So one thing is to actually make sure you're good at least one thing, right? Which the employer works on, right? So you have to have the right skill set and a way to execute those skill sets, apply them to real world projects, right? So that's definitely one of the things that you would want to do, and that's one of the reasons why an employer hires you on board in the first place, right? That's why he is actually offering you the top dollar. And so once you're done that, then you actually make your way in. And a lot of the employers, especially for people who are just starting off or just new grads from the campus, right, who are just starting out, they would typically have some kind of a boot camp. Not so for the lateral hires, because they would have gone through much of that in their previous jobs in terms of experience gained. But for most of the new grads, most companies, at least I remember that being the case in a few companies that I've worked in. So they would have some boot camps, and recently, and most recently, right? So I was doing a kind of a workshop for one of the crypto companies, and that workshop was actually part of their boot camp as well. So they would then teach the new grads, or rather have the new grads go through that boot camp and experience some of the intricacies of the tech stack, or for that matter, not necessarily from the application of that directly to the work that they do. Sometimes it could be that way, but they would definitely expose them to the tech stack that is generally being used as part of their day-to-day work. So that would be a plus, in my opinion, if that the company offers something along those lines. And generally, they would have some kind of a learning budget for that, allocated for that as well. So if that is the case, then definitely that would be a big plus in my opinion, because that also gives you an insight in terms of what technology is being used, and what frameworks are being used, and it really puts you in a kind of very sweet spot as you approach the actual project work. Okay, and so that's one part of it. And another thing that you would also want to do is, as a newly onboarded person, um, directly from university or the college for that matter, you'd also actually reach out to your managers, and they would actually assign you mentors when you first get entry into the companies. And these mentors are required to let you know about certain aspects of the project in terms of the functionality of the application that they're developing, the possibly the let's say the roadmap of that particular application, and what needs to get done, let's say in terms of a 3-month plan, 6-month plan, and stuff like that. So so those mentors would help you a lot. They would also expose you to the code base that is being used, that is being worked upon. And and then it is up to you to go back and then look at that, and then if you have additional questions, make a note of them, and then set up times with them, which are because you may want to essentially collate all the questions in one go, and go back to them in one go, as opposed to doing a back and forth, because obviously some of these mentors would also be busy, right? And they would be looking at other things in the project. So you would be better off actually collating some of your queries and questions and going back to them and asking, okay, this is something that I came up, and you can also instead of just posing the question straight off, right? You could also say, okay, this is what I ran into in the code base, and this is what I think about it, and tell me if I'm actually on the right lines. I think that would be a better way to approach them, rather than straight off asking them, what this is and what this is not, right? So, so as a new entrant, right? So as an ST1 or ST2 or ST3 or ST2, right? So you would be expected to know after a point, right? So for example, let's say you might make a plan with your manager saying that, after 30 days, I want to know what I need to be at, right? And you make a plan at 30 days, what I want to do, at 60 days, where I want to stand, right? And what the expectations are. And you can actually, you know, frequent have timely or timed interactions with him. So it could be like every 2 weeks or every month, in and have check-ins with him in terms of what you accomplished during that time, and then check if it's actually in line with their expectations. And in case it is not, then obviously you can ask them for more information, and keep that dialogue happening, right? So end of the day, right, it is all about a dialogue. It is all about making sure that everybody's in the same page, especially you and your immediate manager, in terms of the expectations. And so that actually helps things a lot. And obviously you make those plans. So for example, you might have a 90-day plan, and eventually, after 90 days, you would have some level of understanding for the code base, some level of understanding of the business application, right? Some level of interaction with the rest of the team, whether it's going to be your development team, or whether it's going to be your test engineering team, or the QA team, right? So you would actually interact with them, try to gain as much insight into the project as possible, try to assimilate as much, as much context as possible, and try to form your own opinions, try to form your own understanding of that, right? So that's going to help a lot, correct? And eventually you'll get to a point where you might be asked at some point in time to take up some feature development. Again, these to begin with, these could be some features that need not be very high priority, because end of the day, they also want to make sure that you are not overwhelmed with a lot of complex things which are part of the project. So again, it also depends on company to company, right? So for example, if you enter a startup world, it could be a lot more different compared to, let's say, conventional workplace. Let's say, for example, a typical company like Adobe, or for that matter, any fine companies, right? So it depends on the workplace as well. So if it's a startup world, probably you expect the pace to be very frenetic, very hectic. But that's the lay of the land, and if you have signed up for it, I think you're expected to embrace that. Okay, and once you do that, right, it is important to get your work into production. So for example, you've done some work, and that needs to go into production, because that needs to see the light of the day, where the customer is able to experience that particular workflow. Because for managers, that's one way of looking at how it is impacting the business, right? And that's how they can actually essentially say that his particular, reporting is important for the project. Is actually, his investments, or his end of the day, he's investing on all these people who have been hired. So all those investments, if they have to reap the rewards, he has to have a tangible way of actually um, essentially evaluating that, right? So that the only way to do that is to actually push the artifacts, or the core artifacts that they've developed, and essentially you would have taken them through different stages of the development process. So they would have gone through vetting by the QA, they would have gone through the let's say the beta testing, or the alpha testing, and finally all the way to the, let's say, the sandbox environment, and finally to the production environment. So that gives you enormous confidence, trust me, because now you would have gone through the entire cycle, and the confidence begins to show in you in terms of taking on more complex work, expanding your reach, expanding your breadth of involvement in terms of projects, right? So that's one way you can approach it. And and the more you expand, right, the your influence begins to show. You begin to act like an expert in a particular field, and people begin to essentially take note of that. So that's how you would definitely approach that part. And so that's the business aspect of it. And there is also um, the which is the functional aspect, of course. And there is also the deliverable aspect of it, right? So in terms of in terms of the quality of the deliverables, right? How good is the code, right? How quickly you're able to churn out quality code, and how quickly you're able to find issues without them being, without waiting for, let's say, the test engineering to find them out, right? So it also says a lot about you as a person who cares about details, who cares about attention to detail, who is very detail oriented, right? So it says a lot about you as a person, as somebody who's very detail oriented, who's very authentic, very systematic when it comes to delivering and owning up a deliverable, right? So those are the kind of things that you definitely want to ensure. That's the impression that you want to provide to people around you. And of course, a lot of your other skills like soft skills will also come into play. So for example, you could come across as somebody who's very helpful, right? Who is very inquisitive, very eager to know things, right? And you could actually say, you did some projects in your university, and this is how you did it, and something as a kind of a best practice that you could suggest there. It may not fly, it may go well. At the end of the day, it shows you as a person who's actually thinking on his feet, who's applying his knowledge and his ability to apply to a real world use case or a real world project.
Thanks, Prasad. Prasad, the next set of two questions which we have, they're pretty much similar in nature. So I would just try to club them and ask you.
Sure.
Now there are good coders in the industry, and there are also exceptional coders in the industry, right?
Okay.
So would want to understand from you that what are those qualities which kind of differentiate like the exceptionally well versed developers from, let's say, a good developer. So what set of skill sets give you the additional edge, right? And how do you go about to develop those set of skill sets?
Okay, very good question actually. Um, so typically the software development life cycle, right? It goes through multiple phases, right? So you develop the software, and then you have to develop the unit testing test cases for them, and then subsequently you test that for the functionality which is being built. And once you're done that, it actually goes through the code review by the peers or from people in the team that are actually your coworkers, right? So and he would then look up for it in terms of errors, and he would classify them based on whether an error is severe, right? It could be a severe error. It could be a error with very low severity, which could be a, let's say for example, a cosmetic error, right? It could be an error, let's say, for example, a label issue, right, in a UI, or for that matter, some kind of an error message that was slightly deviating from that. So that would actually qualify itself as a very uh, low severity issue. But they could also be defects in terms of, let's say, um, that would actually be the code could be working, but the algorithm is not very performant in terms of applying the right kind of data structures or right kind of algorithms itself. So, for example, your algorithm could be operating in the space of, let's say, if I had to take the big O notation, it could be O n square, but it could be in the O. It could actually be brought down to O n, right? So those would qualify as that would actually be the difference between, let's say, from a let's say exceptional coder to a not so exceptional coder, in my opinion. And also the algorithms that you use, the data structures that we use, right? And the conciseness or the compactness of the code, right? And how it expresses the logic in a compact and concise way, and how you essentially structured the code in a way that's understandable to anybody without actually commenting commenting the code, right? So sometimes it so happens that, and I've seen that as well, certain times the code without being commented cannot be understood in some place, because especially if a new developer comes along, he has to go through the code base and understand, and he has to look at actually the commands to understand what the code base is doing. In certain cases, it might be required, because sometimes what happens is that a certain code base, right, it's very important, and it is a highly optimized code that would have been written by experts in your team, and they want to make sure that they have put the right comments they put the right comments inside the code base so that anybody who's touching that code base is aware of the fact that any code changes need to go through the right vetting process, need to go through the right secure the quality gates before they even make it in production. So so in my opinion, the code has to be maintainable. It has to be readable for anybody, and it has to take advantage of the right programming constructs, right? So, for example, let's say you are a JavaScript developer, and you are using some of the older JavaScript constructs in place of, let's say, the newer ES6 constructs, right? So, as a reviewer, your peer would be a little put off by that because you are sticking to the older conventions as opposed to making use of newer conventions, which are the industry standard, right? So, and then another example that I would give is that, let's say you are a React developer, and as you know, React uses the virtual DOM, right? So if you do not make use of the virtual DOM and directly access the real DOM in your React component code, that would be a bad smell, bad code smell for the reviewers, right? So as a developer, it is important to follow through on some of these best practices. And generally, for a project, right, there would be an expected best practices guidelines that they would actually be circulating in certain places, and you might do well to look at that and understand it, as well as bring in your own knowledge and learnings into the play. And essentially, if something is missing, you could actually suggest, okay, this is something that I found useful and something that's very performant, and ask them if you can consider it to review that, and they'll be more than happy to review that, actually. So, so end of the day, right? Um, a very high performant code results in a quick rendering of the web page, let's say, right? And it also results in how the search engines actually find out about your website. So it amounts to the right SEO SEO context, right? The SEO awareness will be faster, and that could be a difference between a customer being onboarded on your uh, onboarded on your platform, as opposed to him moving to a competitor's platform, right? So ultimately, all that is going to make sense in the final analysis.
Great, Prasad. I think that answers the next set of the next question which we have in the next slide as well. Can we quickly move to the slide which talks about how the next slide, to be precise, which where the question is around how the industry has shaped up in the past 5 years, and what do we predict will happen in the tech industry in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's very interesting questions, and honestly, I wish I had a crystal ball, but yeah, but I guess we can all make some fair, reasonable, uh, assumptions in terms of where the industry is headed. So if I were to actually make that assessment, right? So a couple of things actually. So how has the industry grown in the change in the past 5 years? Quite a bit, actually. So so right now we see a lot of SaaS players, right? Software services with very niche offerings, especially in, let's say, identity space, security space, the messaging space, in the communication space. For example, I'm not sure if anybody of you have heard about Twilio, which is essentially a messaging and communication SaaS product, identity space. I know about Okta. Any of you have heard about Okta? Okta is one of them. Auth0 is one of them, right? And we have all of these other interesting cloud service providers. For example, we have Heroku, we have Netlify. A lot of interesting innovations have happened around that. right? So the last 5 years, there has been a massive that's been a massive upshot, actually, especially for innovators or creators who want to bring their ideas to the wild, to the mainstream, and essentially get a sense of the real world expectations, right? So with all these um, SaaS offerings, right? The new age apps will easily integrate with these offerings, and in place of, let's say, building all these solutions in house, right? So, but yeah, as I said, this is already happening. There's nothing new about it. So this is also how something the API economy thrives on, right? So API economy is all about providing niche services to the end users. So you take you extract the complexity of a certain domain. So, for example, the auth or the security or the identity space is a very complex beast, right? So, and it also is subject to a lot of these, let's say, norms. They could be norms related to, let's say, GDPR, or for that matter, what are the norms we have here? They could be HIPAA norms, or for that matter, which is HIPAA is again the health sector related norm, which is a conformance law, by the way, internationally or globally for that matter. So there is a lot of complex things that are happening down there, right, behind the scenes, and something as a startup, or as even as a as a conventional enterprise, you don't want to get into, because that's going to eat into your um, um, prime time, right? Because you have your own business scope, business case that you want to solve, something that you want your core work to happen in, and you want to essentially, let's say, outsource some of this functionality to niche players who can actually do the job for you. So that's definitely happening. And secondly, I also see that machine learning and AI solutions, they will get a lot more pervasive. They're already there, but in the years to come, they will be a lot more pervasive. You will find a lot of machine learning and AI solutions deployed everywhere, because eventually a lot of automation is going to hinge in that movement towards machine language. And I will also see a lot of movement happening towards low code and no code platforms, which allows non-technical people to assemble solutions with drag and drop wizards, right? Salesforce is one such example. But however, I would also say that, that will not necessarily completely override the current way the software development works, because end of the day, low code no code solutions have their own place, right? So um, there there are also times where enterprises need tailor-made customized solutions, which requires customized development as well. And finally, if you have to look at it between in the next 5 years, I think the big rock, right, which is the Web 3.0, the decentralized apps, also known as the dApps, right, with use cases in crypto and decentralized finance, etc. So those will also, I think, come of age, or become mainstream. And in short, automation will hold sway in the next 4 to 5 years, big time. And having said that, these are going to be very interesting times for all people, consumers, as well as people in the technology space. And if they keep themselves connected, um, really exciting times ahead.
Got it, Prasad. That was really detailed. Prasad, one particular question which learners are specifically interested in is, what's the typical hiring process at top MNCs, like you yourself work with Visa, right?
Sure.
Then Cisco. So what is the typical hiring process at these top MNCs?
Sure. So again, I will address it from multiple angles, because I see that you might have some people who might be applying collaterally in a collateral way, for example, not necessarily as new grads, right? So I will try to address this in a generic way, and also in a generic way, and also a generic hiring process that is prevalent in most product development companies. I mean, I think that would be a better way of looking at it. So for if you take it from a typically from a new grad angle, right? So the hiring would involve testing the candidates on the core of fundamentals, right? The computer science fundamentals, which would be, for the most part, it would be the data structures and the algorithms. So the key consideration would be in how the candidate breaks down a problem and applies the concepts. I think that would be the key. And here again, you would be required, I mean, in most places, of course, again, it might differ in other places. You might be required to solve a couple of problems in, let's say, in an hour. So for example, if you were to interview today in Google, right, as a new grad, you would be required, given the first problem, and you'd be, so it would be like, I would say, in medium complexity, okay? And you would be required to solve that in, let's say, um, half an hour, let's say, okay? And you would be allowed to break it down, and then essentially come up with a code, and then explain that to him, and write unit test cases and run it, um, you know, run those unit cases against the code base, right? So you would be expected to use some of your computer science fundamentals that you would have learned in the university or the college, and use the right set of algorithms in terms of how performant you can make it, right? So that would be how it would go for the new grads. That would be the first round. But there would also be a couple of other rounds as well. So, for example, there could be a hiring manager round, right? It would be typically about trying to know you as a person, know you as how temperamentally you are, how recipient you are for, let's say, if there are disagreements, right? They would try to pose situational questions to you in terms of how you would behave, or how would you react in a particular situation, because end of the day you would be working with their team, working with them on at least on an 8-hour basis, right? And they want to make sure that they are comfortable working with you, right? So your soft skills come into play as well there. So how do you respond to a question? How do you actually respond to criticism of your code? So for example, they might say, okay, did you think on certain lines? And did you think on how you could make a certain algorithm function, let's say, in constant time, or let's say in logarithmic time, right? So how do you respond to that? So all that will actually make a difference in how you're perceived, right? And eventually make an impact, or eventually give them a clue in terms of whether a person, he or she, is going to result in a good hire or not, right? And also in most of the big companies, there might be another round, which could be a kind of a bar raiser round. And these people, only what they do is typically they try to keep uh, the interview process normalized. So for example, they want to make sure that the people who are being hired are normalized. They are all at the kind of same level. I mean, if you have to take the bell curve as an example, right? So not necessarily away from that, right? I mean, it could be away from that in a positive way, but if it's going to be away from that in a different direction, then obviously it would hint that they may not lean towards going for a higher, right? So, and they would also carry some kind of a veto power in terms of saying that they actually liked a particular person's attitude in terms of approaching the problem, in terms of thinking out loud, right? So every time you go to the interview, you actually want to think out loud and try to let the interviewer know that you're trying to solve the problem in a very methodical way, and also trying to explain your thought process to him instead of sitting quiet and then for 5 minutes and then lose your flow as well, right? And eventually what also happens is that during this process, if your thought process is incorrect, the interviewer is going to steer you in the right direction as well. So you want to keep all that, all those parts in mind when you do that. So those are the kind of things. And plus, you would also have the HR round, which is typically the final round, and who actually ask you about, this is essentially the rolling out the offer kind of, um, you know, situation where they're saying, they're rolling out the offer to you and explaining to you about different benefits and all that stuff that come with the job role. So this is for the new grads. I think for the slightly people with the slightly higher experience, I think the focus would be, in some companies, the focus would still be on coding. Okay, and subsequently, the focus would also turn to more higher concepts. For example, it could be on designing a full-blown system and given a particular problem, and then you'd be asked to essentially, prove why your system actually is good and how it actually conforms to the requirements in terms of functional requirements, or it could be non-functional requirements as well. So for example, non-functional requirements are going to be very key for, especially for the big tech companies, right? And so for example, if you're working at Google or Amazon, they would be looking at scale as a very major requirement, as a non-functional requirement. So how scalable it is, or a particular design is, how performant it is, in terms of, it's surging traffic, right? So let's say your website goes viral and there is a surging traffic and people are trying to, access you, and whether your website actually responds to you in a linear way, meaning without any delays or without any latency issues, is how your design will be judged whenever you design, whether it's actually taking care of a lot of interesting design patterns that are typically at play when you design for, let's say, a distributed system, which is going to be used across the globe by people across the globe, right? Where your audience is the entire globe, right? So for example, Google, right? The entire audience for them is the entire globe. So and how do they actually make sure the search experience is very pleasant? It's very latency and the response times are very fast, right? So a lot of those design, you know, um, the design decisions that you take as a system designer will come into play. And so that would be one of the key diversion, I would say, and compared to, let's say, a new grad, or for that matter, a lateral hire. But in most cases, right, if you're going in as an IC or individual contributor, or a purely a technical lead, or for that matter, a technologist or tech-centric guy, they would expect you to code and understand code, right? But if you are, let's say, a manager who are a kind of techno managers, right? I mean, most of these tech companies will not just have people managers. They would be mostly technology aware in terms of understanding the fundamentals of the technology and map it to their business. And they will also have, of course, people management roles as well. So, that's how you would be essentially interviewed at a. So this is how, at a broad, if I had to look at it broadly, they would essentially try to look into your, try to gauge your expertise and try to essentially size up things and essentially take a call in terms of how things going forwards.
Understood, Prasad. Prasad, there are a last few set of questions which have been posted by our learners. Right. So I think while most of the questions have been covered while we discussed about certain aspects, right? Two questions which are still left would be, there is one question around the industry moving towards no code tools or low code model, right?
Okay.
So what are your thoughts around it, and how do you see this developing in the longer term?
Yeah, I've heard about low code, no code, and I've actually tried to experiment with some of those platforms, right? So while they have a space for a particular segment of applications and essentially certain problem statements, it is I would say it would be premature to say that they will essentially rip and replace the existing way of conventional software development process, because eventually, right, they would always be requirements or business cases which need to be tailor made, which need to be very specific, which need to work in a certain way, right? Which the low code, no code aspects may not have a complete coverage of, right? And so, in that sense, I would look at it as a very good addition to the way we function in the software development, but they will not be, or they cannot be, in my opinion, treated as a one size fits all solution, right? So they cannot make that. So I mean, so that's my take on it. And I would also say that this is very akin to the way we people looked at, let's say, the cloud deployments and the on-prem deployments, right? So because we have options available in the cloud for deployments, it doesn't mean it invalidates the deployments on-prem, right? So there are companies which still want to deploy on-prem because of, for whatever reasons, the compliance reasons, for, let's say, regional, complying to regional laws, right? Local laws, right? So, and then certain aspects of it, they might want to go ahead and leverage the cloud for for the cost reasons, right? So it might be cost effective for them to actually run in the cloud as opposed to running or standing up an entire data center for a particular use case and incurring more charges. And in the long run, it might be more cost effective for them to run their workloads in the cloud. So, and eventually they might go into a kind of situation where they run certain workloads in the cloud, certain workloads on the on-prem. So essentially leading to a kind of a hybrid model. So I would say they can coexist, and I don't think they can replace one another completely.
Understood, Prasad. Prasad, on that note, we will just move to our last question,
Sure.
which hasn't been picked up so far. So there is a question around how developer roles differ from startups and established companies, right? So what are your thoughts on that, Prasad?
Um, so if you ask me, I would say it is about the involvement, right? So for example, in a typical startup, where things are not necessarily very process oriented, right? And whereas in a conventional company, which has been around for quite some time, they would have a lot of processes in place, and it's easier to navigate the space. But whereas in a startup, it's a lot of, like, do it yourself kind of a stuff, right? So you have to actually dig through some of those things and try to understand stuff on your own without a lot of help or kind of hand holding. So that would be one of the things that I would look at in terms of complexity. But both would expect the same level of, let's say, expertise in term being brought to the table by people. So in case of, let's say, trying to bring a solution to the table given a business problem, and in a startup, it would be a lot more hectic, a lot more frenetic in terms of the pace. You get to fiddle your hands in a lot more things than you would in a conventional company where it's more process oriented. So there are different pros and cons to that. On one hand, you get exposed to a lot of things in a startup environment in a very short period of time. Uh, So that's definitely a plus, where you're required to do a lot of things in, let's say, in the first 30 days or first 60 days, right? So and then if you're up for it, and if you're chosen to do that kind of a work, so so be it. But whereas in a typical conventional company, things are a lot more structured, a lot more process oriented, and they allow you to express yourself in a very structured way, and give you time to blossom, give you time to express yourself. So that's one way I would look at it. But otherwise, from a skill angle, uh, I think nothing is really different, because end of the day, both of them are trying to accomplish certain business goals, and skills are non-negotiable, right? And so that's how I would look at it.
Got it, Prasad. So on that note, we will conclude today's session. Prasad, thanks a lot for joining with us and
Sure.
answering each of the questions in absolute detail. So that was, I think, really helpful and insightful for all of us. And my message to all the learners before closing would be that, attend all your sessions, take all the assignments in time, and also the re-level test is free of cost. So keep attempting the re-level test, and I wish you all the best, all the very best for your future. Thanks a lot. Have an amazing evening ahead. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Ronendu, and thank you for the rest of the cohorts who've been patiently listening to me. I know it's not easy to